The 12 months is 1867, and the place is a dimly lit room inside the Russian Foreign Ministry in St. Petersburg. Outside, the wind is howling off the frozen river. However, within the atmosphere is even less warm. An institution of powerful men, which includes the Grand Duke Constantine, the brother of Tsar, are looking at a map of the world. They are looking at a large yellow stain that covers the top left nook of North America. It is a territory of immense length. It is twice the scale of Texas. It is full of countless forests, towering mountains, and rivers teeming with salmon. It is a land that we now recognize includes billions of dollars in gold and oil. But these men do not see wealth. When they take a look at this map, they see a liability, they see a trap. They see a loan charge that they cannot find the money for. This territory is Russian America, which we call Alaska. And in some months, these guys will make the decision to sell it for a rate that works out to approximately 2 cents an acre. To the cutting-edge observer, this seems like the finest mistake inside the records of real property. It looks as if madness. Why might an empire sell a continent-sized territory for less than the price of some buildings in Manhattan? The solution is not that the Russians have been silly. It isn't that they did no longer understand about the capability sources. The solution is that the Russian Empire was bankrupt. This is the story of ways a superpower became delivered to its knees, no longer by using an invading navy, but via compound interest. It is the tale of how the Crimean War destroyed the Russian treasury and how a secret plan to liquidate a colony became the simplest manner to save the Romanov dynasty from monetary collapse. To recognize why the Tsar sold Alaska, we should rewind 11 years to 1856. Russia had simply misplaced the Crimean War. It became a humiliating defeat. For centuries, Russia had been the bogeyman of Europe. It became the land of the limitless army. The other powers of Europe feared the Russian bear. But the Crimean War exposed the bear as sick and susceptible. The British and French armies had invaded Russian soil. And regardless of combating on their home turf, the Russians had been crushed. Their rifles had been previous. Their supply traces were non-existent. Their ships had been manufactured from wooden, whilst the British ships had been manufactured from iron. But the military defeat turned into not anything as compared to the economic disaster. Wars are high-priced. To fight the British and French, Russia had printed money hundreds of thousands of rubles. This brought on big inflation. The value of the ruble collapsed. At the same time, they'd borrowed closely from European banks to buy guns. Now the warfare became over, however the debt remained. The treasury in St. Petersburg became empty. The interest payments were ingesting up a massive percentage of the national finances. The new Tsar Alexander II checked out his empire and noticed a monetary black hole. He knew that if Russia became going to survive, it needed to modernize. It had to construct railroads. It needed to construct factories. It needed to abolish serfdom and create a modern-day economy. All of this required massive quantities of capital. But no one desired to lend money to a loser. The credit score rating of the Russian Empire turned into in the bathroom. The bankers in London and Paris, the Rothschilds and the Barings had been cautious. They wanted to look balanced earlier, then they opened their vaults once more. This is where in Alaska enters the equation. For the Russian authorities, Alaska became now not a prized asset. It was a cash pit. The Russian-American Corporation, which became a state-subsidized enterprise, just like the British East India Company turned into a fee of the colony. But unlike the East India Company, which became looting India for profit, the Russian-American agency became bleeding cash. The sea otter population, which have been the supply of the fur change, turned into hunted close to extinction. The enterprise was failing. It required subsidies from the government to hold the lighting on. So, not handiest become the Russian authorities broke, however it became additional, subsidizing a failing enterprise on the other side of the arena. But there was a darker fear than simply money. There became the worry of geopolitics. The Grand Duke Constantine was the Tsar's younger brother and the top of the Russian Navy. He changed into a realist. He checked out the map, and he noticed a strategic nightmare. Alaska shared a huge border with Canada, and Canada was a British colony. The British Empire turned into Russia's arch-enemy. The British Navy dominated the oceans. The Grand Duke knew that if some other conflict broke out among Russia and Britain, the British Navy might honestly sail into the ports of Alaska and take it. Russia had no Pacific fleet robust enough to shield it. They could not ship troops across Siberia rapid sufficient. Alaska changed into defenseless. The Grand Duke wrote a secret letter to the Foreign Minister Alexander II. In this letter, he laid out a cold and calculating good judgment. He stated that America represents the future of the continent. He said that in the end America would need to govern all of North America. He argued that if Russia held on to Alaska, They might eventually lose it to the British for not anything. The British could simply seize it as a prize of conflict. It changed into hire, he argued, to sell it to the Americans now, even as they could still get some cash for it. It changed into a method of cutting losses. It changed into a hearth sale. But there was a trouble. The Americans had been busy. It became the overdue 1850s, and America changed into tearing itself aside. The tension between the North and the South became reaching a boiling factor. The American authorities became paralyzed by way of the controversy over slavery. They were not within the temper to buy a frozen wilderness from the Tsar. The Russian ambassador in Washington, a smart and fascinating man named Edward de Stuckel, was advised to wait. He was informed to maintain the concept alive, but to be affected person. Then in 1861, the American Civil War exploded. For 4 years, America became engulfed in blood. The sale of Alaska turned into placed on maintain. But throughout this time, something thrilling came about. Russia and the U.S. have become great pals. It appears extraordinary nowadays, given the Cold War history, but in the 19th century, Russia and America had been natural allies. They each hated the British Empire. During the Civil War, Britain and France had been secretly flirting with the concept of recognizing the Confederacy. They desired to look America wreck into weaker international locations due to the fact a united America became a danger to their worldwide dominance. The Tsar Alexander II saw this. He knew that if the Union fell, Britain might become even greater powerful. So he made an ambitious circulate. He sent the Russian Navy to visit the ports of New York and San Francisco. It became a clean sign to London and Paris. If you intrude inside the American Civil War, you must fight Russia too. The American public became ecstatic. They threw parades for the Russian sailors. They noticed Russia as their best genuine pal in Europe. This friendship would emerge as the muse of the Alaska deal. When the Civil War led to 1865, the Union had triumphed, but the U.S. authorities became exhausted. They had been drowning of their own battle debt. The Secretary of State, William Seward, was an expansionist. He believed that it changed into America's future to govern the entire continent. He desired Alaska. He saw it as a bridge to Asia. He noticed the capacity for change with China and Japan. But he had a hard time convincing everybody else. The American humans had been bored with conflict and spending cash. They checked out Alaska and noticed a block of ice. The newspapers known as it Seward's Folly and Seward's Icebox, they mocked him. They asked why he desired to buy a polar undergo lawn. Meanwhile, in St. Petersburg, the situation changed into getting desperate. The Russian treasury was significantly low on tough foreign money. They had full-size payments coming due on their overseas loans. These are wished coins, and he wanted it rapid. He summoned Stuckel again to the Winter Palace. The meeting passed off in December of 1866. The Tsar, the Grand Duke, the Foreign Minister, and the Finance Minister had been gift. The Finance Minister, Reuter, changed into the most annoying man inside the room. He presented the ledger. It became bleeding purple ink. He instructed Tsar that even a small sum from the sale of Alaska might help stabilize the ruble and pay the hobby on the Rothschild loans. They determined on a fee. They might ask for $5 million. However, they authorized Stuckel to barter. They instructed him to get as a lot as he should, but the priority became to shut the deal. They wanted the money via the next monetary zone. Stuckel was given his marching orders. He traveled lower back to Washington, D.C., sporting the secret offer in his pocket. He became a diplomat, but he changed into about to turn out to be a salesman. Stuckel arrived in Washington in March of 1867. He went straight to William Seward. He discovered a receptive audience. Seward became eager. He wanted a victory to distract the general public from the messy aftermath of the Civil War and the impending impeachment of President Andrew Johnson. Seward and Stuckel began a recreation of poker. Stuckel began excessive. Seward started out low. They handled over the fee of a continent. But Stuckel had a mystery weapon. He knew that Seward desired this deal greater than the American Congress did. He knew that Seward was vain and wanted to leave a legacy. Finally, they agreed on a charge, $7.2 million. It became extra than the Russians had anticipated. The greater 200,000 changed into introduced a cowl, the cost of the prevailing Russian infrastructure inside the colony. But there was a seize. The deal needed to be signed right away. Stuckel desired to send the telegram to Tsar earlier than the American Congress ought to awaken and block it. The tale of the signing is famous. It changed into the nighttime of March 29, 1867. Stuckel went to Seward's residence in the evening to inform him that Tsar had given his approval by telegraph. Stuckel counseled. They meet the next day to sign the treaty. Seward driven away his card game and stood up. He said, "Why wait till day after today? Let us make the treaty tonight. Stuckle changed into amazed. He stated, "But your branch is closed. You don't have any clerks." Seward smiled and stated, "If you could muster your legation through nighttime, you'll discover me looking ahead to you on the Department of State." So, in the nighttime, the Russian diplomats and the American officials collected on the State Department. The clerks had been dragged off the bed. The gas lamps had been lit. They labored feverishly to draft the final treaty. Maps have been unfolded out on the tables. The boundaries were drawn. The destiny of the indigenous humans of Alaska, the Tlingit, the Haida, Aleut, become determined without a single one among them being present. They have been transferred from one empire to every other like farm animals. The treaty said that the inhabitants of the ceded territory might be admitted to the entertainment of all the rights, advantages, and immunities of residents of America. But this promise might be damaged for a century. At 4 inside the morning on March 30th, the treaty becomes signed. Seward had bought an empire the size of Western Europe for much less than 2 cents an acre. He became jubilant. He had secured the protection of America. Stuckle became relieved. He had secured the liquidity of the Romanov dynasty. He dispatched a telegram to St. Petersburg that truly said, "Treaty signed, 7.2 million." But the drama was no longer over. Signing a treaty is one aspect, paying for its far any other. The United States Congress needed to approve the money, and the Congress turned into in a bad mood. The House of Representatives turned into controlled through guys who hated President Johnson and through extension hated his Secretary of State, William Seward. They noticed the purchase as a waste of cash and a manner to increase the strength of an unpopular management. They threatened to dam the appropriation of finances. This is wherein the tale shifts from excessive diplomacy to low corruption. Stuckle realized that the deal was in threat. He had promised Caesar the cash. If he went again to Russia empty-handed, he would be disgraced. So he did what any desperate lobbyist might do. He resorted to bribery. The Russian authorities authorized a mystery slush fund. Stuckle started out to wine and dine the influential congressman. He hired powerful lobbyists. He located favorable articles within the newspapers. Thousands of greenbacks in gold have been exceeded out in brown paper envelopes. The Russian ambassador, the consultant of the autocrat, changed into shoving for American democracy. It is predicted that over $100,000 of the acquisition rate become truly used to bribe the U.S. Congress to vote for the acquisition. It changed into a dirty deal executed inside the shadows. However, it worked. The House of Representatives ultimately voted to approve the budget. The test turned into cut. The switch of the money turned into a complicated monetary operation. The U.S. Treasury issued a warrant for $7.2 million, but Russia did not want bucks. They wanted gold, and they wanted it in London. The warrant changed into given to the Russian legation, who then deposited it in a U.S. bank. The bank then worked with the Rothschilds to transfer the cost to London, where it became converted into gold bullion and deposited into the accounts of the Russian government. The cash did no longer build colleges or hospitals in Russia. It went nearly right now to pay the hobby at the overseas railroad loans. The sale of Alaska basically paid the loan for the Russian railway device for some greater years. October 18, 1867, the official transfer ceremony came about in Sitka, Alaska. It became a somber affair. Russian troops lined up on one side of the flagpole and American troops on the alternative. The Russian flag was decreased, however it got stuck. A sailor had to climb up the pole to reduce it unfastened. It fell down and landed on the Russian bayonets. It became visible as a bad omen. The American flag turned into raised. Alaska became now American soil. Most of the Russians residing in Alaska packed their baggage and left. They did no longer want to live beneath American rule. The indigenous people appeared on with confusion and dread. They had no longer been conquered. They had now not offered their land. But unexpectedly they'd new masters who spoke a brand new language and taken new laws. For the primary few decades it regarded just like the critics had been proper. Alaska changed into left out. It became governed via the Navy, then with the aid of the Treasury Department. It became a lawless frontier. The American public forgot approximately it. It regarded that Russia had pulled off a brilliant rip-off. They had sold a useless block of ice to a gullible Americans. The $7 million became spent and gone. The Tsar had his railroad. The Americans had their ice field. But history has a way of playing hints on the quick-sighted. In 1896, almost 30 years after the sale, a prospect inside the Yukon discovered a nugget of gold the scale of a thumb. The information spread like wildfire. The Klondike gold rush started. Thousands of fellows rushed north. Millions of greenbacks in gold had been pulled from the rivers and mountains of Alaska. In just a few years, The United States made lower back the acquisition price of Alaska 100 times over. And then came the oil. In the 20th century, large oil fields had been observed in Prudhoe Bay. The strategic fee of Alaska became incalculable at some point of the Cold War. It became the first line of protection in opposition to the very U.S. that had sold it. Soviet bombers have been intercepted over the airspace that their grandfathers had sold for pennies. The radar stations that blanketed the U.S. have been built on land that turned into offer to repay a bad debt. In the give-up, the sale of Alaska is a lesson in the dangers of quick-term questioning. The Russian Empire became so focused on its instant coins flow problem, on its subsequent quarterly debt payment, that it offered off its future. They traded a continent for a few years of solvency. They feared dropping the territory to Britain in order that they gave it to America by no means realizing that America would turn out to be the rival that in the end buried them. As we stop the primary part of this script, we've seen the sale itself. We have seen the determined men in St. Petersburg and the midnight dealings in Washington. We have seen the cash change fingers. But there is some other layer to the story, a layer that entails the specific function of the monetary dynasty of Europe and the hidden mechanisms of the way empires pass bankrupt. In the second part, we are able to dive deeper into the monetary mechanics of the Russian fall apart. We will have a look at how the Rothschild squeezed the Tsar. We will look at the inner Russian debate that was silenced. And we can see how the cash from Alaska turned into not the salvation Tsar was hoping for, but merely a brief bandage on a wound that might ultimately kill the empire. The switch of Alaska turned into whole on paper. However, the ghost of the deal persevered to haunt the Russian Empire. To apprehend the actual intensity of this tragedy for Russia, we need to look far away from the map of North America and examine the ledgers of the Imperial Ministry of Finance in St. Petersburg. The sale of Alaska became no longer a remote actual property transaction. It changed into a symptom of a terminal illness that became rotting the Romanov dynasty from the interior out. That infection changed into debt dependency. The Russian Empire inside the 19th century turned into a paradox. It became the most important non-stop land empire in history. It had the most important military. It had sizable natural assets. But financially, it became a third world USA. It had almost no center magnificence. It had nearly no home capital. If Tsar desired to build a bridge or a cannon or a palace, he needed to borrow the money from London or Paris or Berlin. Russia became the sector's largest debtor. The Crimean War had blown a hole inside the budget that turned into not possible to fill. But Tsar Alexander II had a vision. He desired to industrialize. He looked at Britain and noticed the power of the steam engine. He found out that the supply of British energy turned into, now, not simply the military, however, the manufacturing facility. He released a massive software of railroad creation. He desired to attach the grain fields of the Ukraine with the ports of the Baltic. He desired to connect the mines of the Urals with the factories of Moscow. This was a noble aim, but the execution turned into a monetary disaster. The Russian government assured the loans for personal railroad organization. This supposed that if the railroad went bust, the authorities could pay the traders. It became a big subsidy for incompetence and corruption. The railroad barons took the money, built shoddy tracks, and pocketed the distinction. The state became left protecting the bag. By 1866, the 12 months before the Alaska sale, the Russian authorities became spending nearly a third of its complete finances simply servicing the debt on these railroad loans. This is where in the house of Rothschild enters the story. The Rothschilds were the bankers of Europe. They had branches in London, Paris, Frankfurt, Vienna, and Naples. They have been the masters of the bond marketplace. When a government wanted cash, they went to the Rothschilds. The courting among the Tsar and the Rothschilds changed into complex. The Romanovs have been autocrats. They had been anti-Semitic. They despised the concept of being beholden to Jewish bankers. But they had no desire. The Rothschilds had been the most effective ones, with deep sufficient pockets to hold the Russian Empire afloat. In the years main up to the sale of Alaska, the Rothschilds were placing stress on the Russian finance ministry. They were involved about the stableness of the ruble. They wanted the Russian authorities to build up its gold reserves to back the currency. They warned that if the reserves dropped too low, the hobby fees on destiny loans would skyrocket. Tsar was trapped. He couldn't stop constructing railroads due to the fact that might suggest, admitting that Russia turned into no longer extraordinary electricity. But he couldn't have enough money to pay for them. The $7.2 million from Alaska changed into a drop inside the bucket in comparison to the entire debt. But it changed into a crucial injection of tough foreign money at a second of panic. It became liquidity. It allowed the finance minister Reuter to reveal to European bankers that Russia nonetheless had cash coming in. It allowed them to refinance their loans at a barely better charge. In essence, Alaska changed into bought to improve the credit rating of the Russian Empire. It was a payday loan taken out via a superpower. There had been voices in Russia that antagonistic the sale. There had been patriots and visionaries who noticed the potential of the Pacific. They argued that Russia needed to pivot to the east. They argued that the future of the world lay within the Pacific Ocean, now not the Atlantic. They talked about that Alaska turned into rich in furs and fish and probably minerals. They said that giving up territory become a signal of weak point that could inspire Russia's enemies. But these voices have been silenced. The Grand Duke Constantine and the Finance Minister Reed managed the Tsar's ear. They argued that Russia needed to consolidate. They used the word awareness. They stated Russia must attention on its center hobbies in Europe and Central Asia. They argued that Alaska turned into a distraction, a luxurious they couldn't manage to pay for. They painted an image of a defenseless colony that changed into costing them cash everywhere. They manipulated the records to make the Russian-American organization appearance even worse than it became. They suppressed reports approximately gold being observed in the rivers of Alaska. They wanted the deal to undergo, and they did now not need facts to get inside the way. The tragedy is they were wrong about almost the entirety. They have been wrong about the defensibility of Alaska. If they had stored it and populated it, it would were a fortress. They have been incorrect about the monetary capacity. And they have been incorrect approximately the geopolitical friendship with America. They believed that by means of promoting Alaska to the USA, they would cement a permanent alliance in opposition to Britain. They concept the Americans would be grateful. They thought the Americans would help them in their rivalry with London. But gratitude isn't always an idea in geopolitics. Once the Americans had Alaska, they not needed Russia. In reality, the purchase of Alaska made America a Pacific energy, which subsequently brought it into struggle with Russia's pastimes in Asia. By the 20th century, the friendship changed into lifeless. The two international locations have been enemies, and the land that Russia sold to shop for some years of monetary respiratory room became the head operating base in their finest adversary. The money itself vanished quickly. The $7 million was absorbed into the overall treasury. It became used to shop for railroad system from overseas. Ironically, a whole lot of that equipment become bought from Britain and America. So, the cash went proper return to the countries that were Russia's opponents. The railroad tracks have been laid. However, the underlying hassle of the Russian financial system, the lack of performance, the corruption, the backwardness remained. The sale of Alaska did not save the Romanovs. It merely knocked on time the inevitable fall apart. 50 years after the sale in 1917, the Russian Empire sooner or later ran out of time and money. The debts piled up till they had been unpayable. The First World War broke the lower back of the financial system. Tsar turned into forced to abdicate. The Bolsheviks took power. One of the primary things the new Soviet authorities did changed into default on all the overseas debts of the Russian Empire. They advised the Rothschilds and the French banks that they might no longer pay a single cop. The financial residence of cards that Alexander II had tried to save by means of promoting Alaska eventually fell down. In the Soviet era, the sale of Alaska have become a taboo issue. The communists did no longer want to speak approximately how the Tsars had given away Soviet territory. But there was a lingering experience of bitterness, a feeling that Russia have been swindled. There were rumors and myths that spread a few of the Russian people. Some human beings believed that Alaska changed into now not offered but leased for 99 years. And that the Americans refused to offer it again. Some believed that the ship sporting the gold from London sank and the cash by no means arrived. These myths were false. However, they contemplated a deep psychological wound, a feel of loss. Today, when you examine the Bering Strait, you see a slim stretch of water that separates worlds. On one side is Chukotka, a remote and impoverished location of Russia. On the other side is Alaska, a rich and strategic country of the U.S. The contrast is stark. Alaska has the Trans-Alaska Pipeline, sporting billions of barrels of oil. It has fundamental military bases. It has a thriving fishing enterprise. It is a strategic asset of the very best order. For modern-day Russia, the sale of Alaska is the final what if. What if the Tsar had hung on? What if he had listened to the Denners? What if the Russian flag nonetheless flew over Juneau and Anchorage? The Cold War would have appeared very distinct. The records of the 28th century might be rewritten. Russia would have had a foothold in North America. The Soviet Union may have placed missiles no longer in Cuba, but of their own territory in North America. The geopolitical balance of the arena might have been shifted on its axis. But history is written through the decisions made in determined rooms via determined men. The selection to promote Alaska changed into made by way of guys who were looking at a stability sheet that became bleeding crimson. They were not considering the subsequent century. They had been considering the subsequent mortgage charge. They were sufferers of the short time period thinking that plagues all declining empires. They sacrificed the eternal for the transient. The story of the purchase of Alaska is generally told as an American success story. Seward's folly becoming Seward's triumph. But it's far, perhaps, extra essential to tell it as a Russian tragedy. It is the story of the way debt enslaves international location. It is the story of how monetary weak point results in territorial disintegration. The Russian Empire did not lose Alaska at the battlefield. They lost it at the financial institution. The Rothschilds did no longer seize the territory, but their invisible hand pressured the pen of Caesar. So the next time you notice a map of North America and also you see that giant peninsula attaining out from the continent closer to Asia, recall that it isn't always just a piece of land. It is a monument to a financial disaster. It is the receipt for invoice that a loss-of-life empire could not pay. It is the proof that during the sport of empires, the maximum risky weapon isn't a cannon or rifle, but a promissory notice. And the maximum risky defeat isn't losing a battle, however going for walks out of gold. I'm John, and that is the Cinematic History Tales channel. Subscribe now to stay beforehand of the curve, because whilst the history books are written, you may need to be some of the few who saw it coming. Don't forget to subscribe. Join folks that see what others